Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us at the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies for this, our special seminar on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, the implications for the Caribbean and for international relations. I welcome our Dean of the faculty, Professor David Tennant, to greet you before we go ahead with our proceedings. Welcome, Professor Tennant.
Good evening, moderator, colleagues, students, viewers in the diaspora who are following on Carib Nation TV's YouTube channel, distinguished guests, good evening and welcome. It was once said that war does not determine who is right, only who is left. Colleagues and friends, as the Faculty of Social Sciences host this important discussion on the Russia-Ukraine crisis, implications for the Caribbean and international relations, we are concerned with who and what will be left. From our reports, this battle is being fought on numerous battlefields, in cities and towns through armies and tanks, in cyberspace through hackers, and in markets through economic sanctions. There are so many questions surrounding this conflict being asked by people from all walks of life. More questions than answers, really, because we're all guessing. We don't know what is in the mind of Putin. We don't know how far NATO can be pushed. And so we wonder, what if? What if this war in Ukraine lasts a year or even longer? What will happen with oil prices, food prices, inflation generally? What if NATO gets involved militarily? How will Russia react? Will other countries be pulled in? Where does China stand in all of this? How will our relations with these countries be impacted? How will our supply chains be affected? Will our manufacturers be able to pivot yet again so quickly after COVID? Will international travel be affected on a wide scale? And if so, how will tourism be affected? Will any of our international agreements and aid arrangements and the terms and conditions of loans with any of these countries be affected? Colleagues and friends, these are only some of the questions that are swirling around and are fueling public discourse. And even though no one has definitive answers, in the Faculty of Social Sciences, we have the scholars and experts who can help us to properly frame our questions, to place them in the correct historical and geopolitical context, and to organize them into different scenarios so that we can analyze what scenario is more likely than the other, and what is likely to happen if one scenario or another occurs. So for this discussion, colleagues and friends, we have called on the experts in the faculty to help to guide our thoughts. And we've pulled on our network of contacts so that we can benefit from the expertise and practical experience of a highly regarded practitioner of international relations who has served on the United Nations Security Council. I will not steal our moderator's thunder by introducing our keynote speaker and panelists, but rather I will simply welcome you to this important discussion as the Faculty of Social Sciences at the University of the West Indies continues to contribute to public discourse, adding the results of our research in a practical and meaningful way to help to frame the discussion. I thank Dr. Vassiani, our moderator, for so quickly responding to my call to organize this forum. I thank the panelists for being willing to publicly engage in this critical discourse. And I especially thank our keynote speaker for making himself so accessible to us. And finally, I thank everyone in attendance for joining us and being a part of what undoubtedly will be a riveting discussion. Welcome all to the Faculty of Social Sciences, where we utilize our research to inform and shape public discourse. Welcome and thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Tennant. Thank you for always challenging us to reach for excellence and for showcasing our research. So Professor Tennant said there are so many what ifs, and this evening we are here to discuss in a very measured way several aspects of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Over the last several weeks, our news streams have been saturated with all sorts of issues and conflicts related to Russia and Ukraine. We all feel like experts. We have so much information at our fingertips. However, today, the Faculty of Social Sciences will host this seminar to provide a measured approach, an informed approach to many of the dimensions to this crisis. In our faculty, we do intense research. We teach on several areas related to this crisis. We teach issues of international law and the use of force. And you will see many of our students typing in to let their lecturers know that they are in fact attending this lecture. So you'll see students from a comparative foreign policy class, international and regional organizations, where we look at the role of the UN, the role of NATO, the role of the Organization of American States, CARICOM, and others. So we're really happy today to have with us these experts, Ambassador Curtis Ward, our very distinguished guest and keynote speaker who has been a practitioner in the field. We also have with us our own Professor Suzette Haughton from the Department of Government in the Faculty of Social Sciences here at UMONO. And we also have from the Department of Economics, Dr. Christine Clarke, who will speak with us on the international political economy issues. Now I ask you to listen a bit to Ambassador Ward's background as our keynote speaker. He earned a Bachelor of Arts in Economics and Political Science from Howard University in 1972. He is a Juris Doctor. He did this in international law and business law from Howard University in 1975. He also has a Master's of Law from Georgetown University. Ambassador Ward is a son of Jamaica. He's an attorney at law. He describes himself as semi-retired and a member of the Bar of the District of Columbia and of federal courts. He's also an international consultant with extensive international experience. Ambassador Ward represented Jamaica on the United Nations Security Council for 2 years. The students among us know that the Security Council has 15 members, 5 of whom are permanent, and developing countries such as ours receive the opportunity to serve as non-permanent members. Ambassador Ward has subsequently served for 3 years as an expert advisor to the UN Counterterrorism Committee. He has provided advisory services to the UN, to the Economic Commission for West African states, to governments, to international NGOs, and he has traveled to over 30 countries professionally for meetings, discussions with several government leaders and many high-level government officials, international and regional multilateral organizations, and with several NGOs. All of what those of us who have studied international relations dream of doing. Ambassador Ward has participated in dozens of fora as a keynote speaker, panelist, and roundtable discussant. He has guest lectured and written on subjects related to global security, terrorism and counterterrorism, international sanctions, human rights, rule of law and governance, and on geopolitical and security issues related to the US and also to the Caribbean region. Ambassador Ward is an adjunct professor in the Homeland Security Graduate Program at the University of the District of Columbia in Washington, DC. He's also a former adjunct professorial lecturer at George Washington University, the Elliott School of International Affairs. He has guest lectured on several occasions as well at the National Defense University in Washington, DC, at academic institutions in the US, Jamaica, Germany, the United Kingdom, and Ghana. Ambassador Ward is an active member and a leader of the Caribbean and Jamaican diaspora and has been an advocate to advance Jamaican and Caribbean interests with the US Congress and with successive US administrations for over 45 years. He's a writer, he's a publisher, and he's editor of The Ward Post at thewardpost.com. He's also a host on Carib Nation TV, where we are live streaming now. His podcast, Real Talk with Ambassador Curtis Ward, is available on all popular podcast platforms, and he's a frequent radio and television analyst. Might I add that Ambassador Ward is an active social media user and is quite adept, more so than I have been, with his Instagram and Twitter pages. Please join me in warmly inviting and welcoming Ambassador Curtis Ward. It's my pleasure to have you with us.
Wow. Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Dr. Vassiali, for your kind introduction and for inviting me to this very timely and important discussion for the Caribbean region and the international community. I'm pleased to be sharing this panel with such very distinguished scholars. The Russian-Ukraine crisis has shocked the world, and the stability of the global community has been shaken to its core. The core principles of international norms and laws have been shattered by the illegal invasion of Ukraine by Russia and the egregious acts of aggression and wanton killing of civilians and destruction of non-military targets have raised serious issues concerning war crimes and crimes against humanity being committed by the Russian Federation, its military forces under the direct control of Russian President Vladimir Putin, his political enablers, and his military generals and commanders. The question of accountability and how the guilty parties will be brought to justice will be debated for years to come. The longer the Russian invasion of Ukraine continues, will be the more egregious the crimes, the greater number of civilians killed and displaced, including women, children, the elderly, and infirm. Putin's actions against Ukraine are unjustifiable under any circumstances, and the civilized world is morally outraged at Russia's reprehensible targeting of Ukraine's civilian population. Organizers of this discussion have asked us to address this crisis in the context of implications for the Caribbean and international relations. This crisis presents several issues and sub-issues impacting the Caribbean region adversely, and each country of the Caribbean individually. The impact on international relations will be long debated in theory and practice. We will not be able to give full coverage in this time we have to this very important subject, but I will do the best I can to highlight some important issues, which I believe are central to how Caribbean governments individually and collectively should or may respond. I begin with the core principles held sacrosanct by Caribbean states. The legal framework which has underpinned the region's international relations as independent nations, which began almost 60 years ago. Caribbean government's conduct of international relations has been characterized by unwavering support for the United Nations Charter and the principles enshrined therein. Caribbean governments believe in the independence and sovereignty of states and the inviolability of the territorial integrity of all states. Caribbean governments advocate in defense of human rights and for protection of the vulnerable, and they advocate for the appropriate and effective responses to humanitarian crises. They have advanced the concept of accountability and denial of impunity for those who commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. They have defended the sanctity of civilian life in conflict zones and hold all parties responsible for the protection of women and children in situations of war. They have promoted and defended the right and freedom of all people to self-determination, to choose freely their preferred form of government. Madam Moderator, these are the issues Caribbean governments are known to have pursued over the past several decades, and they have done so with grit and passion, without fear of retribution. Their advocacy on these issues within the United Nations system and in other multilateral fora have earned them a reputation for integrity and international respect for pursuing these moral imperatives. The resolve of Caribbean governments, individually and collectively, is now being challenged by the conflict in Ukraine. Caribbean governments are being called upon to defend those principles for which they have stood for decades. And the only question to be answered is whether current Caribbean political leaders have the political will and the fortitude to do so. How will they respond to this challenge? The principles for which Caribbean governments have stood are being shattered by Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, the wanton killing of Ukraine civilians, and the destruction of civilian infrastructure. The position of Caribbean governments to these egregious actions should be a fait accompli, and there would be no lack of unity in their responses. Caribbean governments would speak with one voice, but I'm not as assured as I used to be that all Caribbean governments, all Caribbean leaders will adhere to these core principles and will act accordingly, even when it is inconvenient to do so. In recent years, there has emerged an erosion of core principles in the policies we have seen coming from some Caribbean capitals. And these core principles now seem to be mere talking points used on certain occasions. The core principles to which I refer are grounded in international law and norms and have defined Caribbean international relations and guided our government's decision-making in global affairs. The current crisis in Ukraine provides an opportunity for recommitment to these principles and for Caribbean advocacy in defense of them to re-emerge as central to Caribbean international relations. In the context of today's global crisis, these principles can provide Caribbean governments with the moral authority to navigate the shark-infested waters of competing geopolitical and strategic interests in their conduct of international relations. From time to time, individual Caribbean governments have strayed from these core principles, but those were exceptions rather than the practice. At this time of global challenges and instability, governments of the region would be wise to return to those principles as a shield to protect their own sustainability as small, weak, vulnerable, independent, sovereign countries. There are many similarly situated countries who are natural allies of the Caribbean in this regard. There are many large, more powerful countries who support those principles, and Caribbean governments must seize unavailable opportunities to build partnerships along shared interests. The international relations of Caribbean governments are being put to the test. Personally, I adhere to the fundamental principle that rules are paramount in maintaining world order. The absence of rules will inevitably lead to global anarchy. Centuries of practice in the relations of states have evolved into international norms, customary international law, which, particularly during the past 100 years, have seen significant strengthening and in many cases codified. Since World War I, we have seen evolve a vast number of multilateral conventions on other international legal instruments covering myriad interstate relations and the behavior of states, adding to the legal framework for the conduct of international relations. Excuse me. One of the foremost authorities on international law and international relations, J.L. Brierley, in his classic book, The Law of Nations, first published in 1928, aptly stated, and I quote, "International law is performing a useful and indeed a necessary function in international life, enabling states to carry on their day-to-day intercourse along orderly and predictive lines," close quote. Brierley's statement is as relevant and applicable in today's interconnected and globalized world as it was 100 years ago. Without the constraints of international behavioral norms, there is the possibility a sole superpower could create its own rules, exempting itself from the constraints of clearly established international law, and seek to impose its will on the rest of the world without any restraint on the use of its superior military power. There is ample evidence to support this premise. And as you are fully aware, even the constraints of law, some countries from time to time either stretch the barriers or violate them outrightly. Such unrestrained exercise of power, no matter how well-intentioned, can lead to global chaos and global anarchy, which is neither a desirable nor acceptable outcome. The Russian invasion of Ukraine has breached all legal and moral barriers. The central importance of law in maintaining political order and the perils that may attend defiance of it are the foundation for international and multilateral relations. Yet the efficacy of law and multilateral cooperation are both soundly rejected by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. No country, I repeat, no country should be allowed to abrogate international law and grant unto itself the authority to determine right from wrong, or when to use its military power in the pursuit of narrow self-interest, particularly when those national interests are contrary and adverse to impact the interests of the global community of nations. No country has the authority to carry out any act of aggression in the pretext of maintaining international peace and security, except with the explicit authority of the UN Security Council, pursuant to the sole authority given by the UN Charter to that body. The UN Security Council has a responsibility, the charter-given responsibility, and the sole authority for the maintenance of international peace and security. It is even more egregious when any country does so to advance a falsely perceived right or its own interest. Russia's invasion of Ukraine is a typical example. The responsibility for the maintenance of global order is best left to a global community acting collectively within the framework of international law, in particular the United Nations Charter and international conventions and treaties. The UN was established with a mandate given by all member states to the Security Council for the maintenance of international peace and security. The authority of the Security Council to act on behalf of all 193 member states of the UN is not in doubt. The responsibility of all UN member states, all 193 of them, to abide by and ensure effective implementation of the decisions of the Security Council is also not in doubt. It is enshrined in the UN Charter, a document having its genesis in international law and established practice in international relations. Time and again, we have seen the Security Council's inability to act, stymied by the anachronistic veto power of the permanent members of the Council, used by them to advance and protect their narrow self-interest, almost always contrary to the broader interest of the international community. Reform of the Security Council is an imperative of multilateralism. It should be the top of the agenda for the maintenance of international peace and security, and for the protection of small, vulnerable states, as are all Caribbean states. Perhaps from these egregious acts Russia is committing against Ukraine and the people of that beleaguered country will emerge a catalyst for Security Council reform and getting rid of the veto power. But then again, that is a discussion for another time. The multilateral system must be strengthened, not weakened. The United Nations is a starting point. It is not necessarily the only solution in the sphere of global mechanisms, but the UN is at the center of global order. I must say, there's a current president in Washington who believes in an expanded role for multilateralism. Now may be an opportune time to press for reform. There's an opportunity to coalesce around common concerns of liberal democracies, that the multilateral system is our best security and the best way to protect the international community from unlawful actions of rogue states and despotic leaders. Caribbean countries can lead in this crusade for reforming and strengthening our multilateral institutions to better serve the common interests of the international community. From my perspective, the emphasis on international organization, to which member states have a legal obligation, in particular the United Nations, makes a lot of sense. Transnational problems require transnational solutions and modalities for cooperation, legal and operational measures. The inability of the Security Council to address the Russian-Ukraine crisis and act against the Russian aggressors is not a failure of the multilateral system. It is a failure of governments who lack the political will to use every lever at their disposal to challenge anachronistic veto of the permanent members. Caribbean governments have not concentrated sufficient effort to reform the Security Council, but can do so only if they are unified in their approach to international relations and their defense of the Charter's core principles. They must not allow themselves to be swayed by geopolitical rivalries or influenced by defunct political ideology. Having said this, Caribbean governments passed the first test on the Ukraine-Russia crisis. All 14 members of CARICOM voted to defend the core principles of the UN Charter when they voted in favor of the UN General Assembly resolution on February 24, 2022, affirming the primacy of international law and the core principles of sovereignty and territorial integrity of states. They also affirm the principle of peaceful settlement of international disputes pursuant to the provisions of the Charter. They were counted among the 141 UN member states in stating unequivocally that Russian aggression against Ukraine was illegal and egregious, demanded immediate cessation of Russian hostilities against Ukraine and withdrawal from Ukraine's sovereign territory. Caribbean leaders may be idealists in their belief in the sanctity of the UN Charter, but in a world dominated by one of two superpowers, one or two, or maybe three, they must be realists in evaluating the complexities and effects of geopolitics on world order. Madam Chair, the second test for Caribbean governments will be how they respond to and navigate the economic and political sanctions against Russia. I have argued for years that sanctions have teeth and can be effective when appropriately designed, situation-based, selected, targeted specifically at the bad actors, effectively implemented and enforced. At the beginning of the century, I was involved in the development and design of targeted sanctions and led a working group to develop guidance for the UN Security Council on effective implementation of targeted sanctions. I'm fully aware of the collateral effect of sanctions. In crisis situations, most unintended consequences are unavoidable. But sanctions are between words and war. When diplomacy fails to change or reverse bad behavior of rogues and governments, sanctions are applied as a last option without resort to military response. My advice to Caribbean leaders is unequivocally reject military intervention to right a wrong. Embrace sanctions as a viable alternative to war. There are 14 independent countries comprising membership of the Caribbean community, each with their own domestic and international concerns. We should not be too surprised to find 14 different positions on any international issue impacting the region. Each country begins by evaluating and determining how a particular issue affects that country's national and international interests. There may be implications specific to each country, and there may be issues which affect the region in different ways. But the countries are bound together by treaty, which urges them to have a common external policy. It is crisis situations, such as the illegal Russian invasion of Ukraine, which challenges Caribbean leaders and the coordination of a common foreign policy for the region. Under normal circumstances, they often face difficulties in arriving at a common external policy, as each member state looks to maximize their own bilateral relations. We saw this scenario played out during the Trump administration and the division created within CARICOM, when Jamaica, St. Lucia, Haiti, and the Bahamas joined in with Trump's policy towards Venezuela, while the other 10 members held fast to a CARICOM policy that was based on certain agreed-to principles and traditional political and economic relations. Who can forget the Mar-a-Lago scene? Regional cohesion in foreign policy took it on the chin, and I don't believe the region has fully recovered. In response to the efforts of the sanctions, each country has unique circumstances and will be impacted in different ways. For example, CIP programs of some Eastern Caribbean states provide access to a second passport and ease of travel to Russian clients. Also, the sanctions are expected to have a negative impact on Russian investments in Jamaica and Guyana, bauxite alumina industries. These governments will have to determine how to navigate these sanctions. Moreover, should China overtly provide support to Russia, it is highly expected the US and its allies will impose some targeted sanctions against China. Should this occur, Caribbean governments will face even greater challenges. At this time, Caribbean governments should be asking questions of the Chinese government and begin to assess their future economic and political relationship with Beijing. Not surprisingly, but it is a failure of CARICOM leaders that they were unable to agree on a regional response to US and EU sanctions against Russia, Russian political businessmen, and military leaders. They have decided to act individually and how best to protect their national interest against the effects of the sanctions. And I'm fearful that their policy decisions will not be based on clear understandings and assessments of the complexities they are dealing with. Some may even be grandstanding. What is even more concerning to me is the possibility of secondary sanctions being imposed against them should their actions facilitate sanctions evasion by the main targets of the US, UK, and the EU sanctions. That possibility would reverberate across the region, and the relationships under the revised Treaty of Chaguaramas could be at risk. I emphasize could rather than will, as there are other factors that will be taken into consideration by the sanctioning authorities. All said, it would be foolhardy for any Caribbean leader to show open disdain for US sanctions and flaunt their opposition in the media. It won't take much for these small, vulnerable, and insignificant economies to feel the pain. Caribbean governments would be best advised to eschew braggadocio and tread softly in these uncharted circumstances. My panelist colleagues are better able to address the economic and political impact on the Caribbean than I am. So I will not delve further into those implications for the region. I will close with reference to US government messaging. The recent article printed in the Jamaica Observer on March 10, 2022, written by the US Embassy charged with the affair in Kingston, was a brief but detailed message on the US position and Washington's expectations of its allies and partners. It stated unequivocally that the US government stands with Ukraine. This article was not merely a restatement of already well-known US policy or a personal message from the US diplomat. This was a message from the US State Department, the diplomatic arm of the US government, directed at all Caribbean governments. Astute political leaders and their advisors will or should understand the inferences and inherent questions which Caribbean governments are expected to answer. As the US government stands with Ukraine and against Russia, Caribbean governments are being asked, where are they aligned? Where do they stand? With the US and Ukraine or with Russia? How each government answers that question is entirely within their rights as sovereign countries. But each, standing alone, must be prepared for any consequences which may flow from the course they have chosen. In addition to the moral imperatives which weigh heavily in favor of standing against Russia and explicitly against Russian aggression and gross violations of the UN Charter and international law, how each government answers the question could impact its future relations with the United States. The entire CARICOM region could possibly experience some level of collateral damage. Caribbean governments will be best served adhering to the core principles which have served them well over the past 60 years. The reasons short to long-term collective interests depend on it. I end by imploring Caribbean leaders not only to be right, but to be morally right. Thank you very much.
Ambassador Ward, thank you so much. You have given us so much to think about. You have given Caribbean leaders the charge to think about their core principles, even during inconvenient times. You have outlined some of the rules of international law and issues of peace and security. You have spoken to us about the importance of sanctions, including secondary sanctions, the implications for this crisis, for the Treaty of Chaguaramas. You have urged Caribbean leaders to tread softly and to think about where we stand. Thank you so much for a very enriching presentation. And I ask the members of our audience to jot down their questions because I know they already have. So thank you very much. At this time, I'd like to acknowledge all our professors online, all our graduate students, all our level 3 students from Gulf 52, our first year students who are just getting a taste of issues of international relations, members of the media who are with us, members of the diplomatic community, whether from embassies hosted in Kingston, Jamaica, or from regional or intergovernmental, international intergovernmental organizations here. Thank you, Ambassador Ward. Now we have a presentation from Professor Suzette Haughton. I'll tell you just a little about my colleague. She is Professor of Security and International Relations. She's also the head of the Department of Government in the Faculty of Social Sciences at UWI-Mona. Professor Haughton earned her PhD in International Relations and Security Studies from the Department of War Studies at King's College London. She also holds an MSc in Government and a Bachelor's of Science in International Relations right here from the Department of Government at UWI. She enjoys exploring new teaching styles, strategies for online learning, which we've had to pivot to over the last 2 years and is now our main way of teaching. She has published extensively on issues of border security and security threats affecting citizens and individual states. Professor Haughton, thank you so much. We look forward to hearing your perspective on this topic. Welcome.
Okay. Thank you, Dr. Vassiani. May I join Professor Tennant, Dean, Faculty of Social Sciences, as well as Ambassador Ward and yourself in welcoming this afternoon all those who have joined us here at on the platform here at UWI Mono for this presentation. I'll give me a minute. Let me just share my screen and then I will begin. All right, so today my topic is international relations underpinning the Russian-Ukrainian war and implications for the Caribbean region. Oops. My central argument throughout the paper that I'll be discussing is balance of power factors precipitated the 2022 Russian-Ukrainian war, and of course, the utilization of balance of power concessions may minimize future Russian-Ukrainian wars. To support this argument, I'll be discussing the contestation of the narrative of war, military power dynamics, Cold War and post-Cold War effects and challenges. I will also look at visualizing the post-war era. And of course, I will look at implications for our region, and then I'll quickly conclude. As you journey with me today, I ask that you ponder this popular adage: war and those engaged in warfare tend to change the course of history. Now, concerning the contestation of the narrative of war between the parties, I ask this question: is the 2022 Russian-Ukrainian situation a war? For Ukraine, and of course the rest of the world, the view is that it is in fact a war. But for Russia, Russia's view is that it's a special military operation. Now, what is the difference between a special military operation versus a war? I think the major difference is that a special military operation is normally carried out within one state and not in a sovereign nation without permission. And it also does not target civilians or civilian facilities. Wars, on the other hand, often involve armed conflicts between states and involve conventional warfare strategies such as ground combat operations or amphibious operations targeting land, air, and sea operations. So it seems to me, therefore, that the Russian-Ukrainian situation is in fact a war. The question I ponder, however, why would President Vladimir Putin, who was a former KGB operative, mistake a special military operation with a war. And we have to turn our lenses to 2014, a catalyst year. In 2014, there was, of course, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and that resulted in the annexation of Crimea, and Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic also sought separation of control from eastern Ukraine. Now, for President Putin, he believes that he's engaging in a special peacekeeping operation in Ukraine, of course, to reinforce claims to Crimea and also to support the independence of Donetsk and Luhansk People's Republic. We hear the talk about demilitarization in Ukraine and denazification. And for President Zelensky, he believes that uninvited use of force on a sovereign territory is in fact a war. Now, as we speak about wars, it's important to know the asymmetric nature of the Russian Ukrainian war. It is well established across the international community that Ukrainian forces are no match for Russian forces. But what is the scale of this asymmetric military power relations? We now turn to some statistics. Russia has a large military. It has active military personnel for just about 1 million, about 2 million reserves. It also has and has spent in the last year significant amounts on its military, US 61.7 billion. And it also has a relatively large population of just about 144 million. Ukraine, on the other hand, has a smaller active force and reserve, has spent less on its military budget as compared to Russia, and has a smaller population as compared to Russia of just about 44 million. Now, what is all of that saying? It's saying that Russia has the world's 5th largest standing army, and it's 5th only to China, that is in number 1, India at the 2nd position, and United States in 3rd position, and then North Korea. So it has a large standing army. And of course, you note that Ukraine is not mentioned among that list. It's also important to note that Russia also has nuclear weapons capability. In fact, it has the largest stockpile of nuclear warheads in the world. And of course, nuclear warheads are the required devices need to detonate a nuclear weapon. It's important to note that Ukraine gave up its weapons in 1994, and it does not have any nuclear warheads. In terms of the stockpile of nuclear warheads, in the lead we have Russia with 5,977, NATO with just about 5,943, of which the United States has the majority of warheads of the NATO countries at 5,428. Now, this map is just to reiterate the information concerning the nuclear warheads, to say that US has 5,428, and of course, Russia in the lead at 5,977. Now, concerning the matter of global nuclear warheads and Russia's nuclear on high alert in the Russian-Ukrainian war, it's important to note that the global nuclear warheads total just about 12,700. And of the 193 countries in the international community, 2 countries combined account for 90% of those global nuclear warheads. So US and Russia account for a whopping 90% of the global nuclear warheads. Now, it's also important to note that 2,000 of the warheads which belong to Russia, US, France, and Britain, as a matter of routine, are held on high alert. What does that mean? It means that they are in a constant state of readiness to be activated for use at any instant. Now, we turn our attention to the post-Cold War imperatives as it relates to the US and strategic security in Europe. And I asked this question: is Ukraine strategically important to the United States? And Ukraine is not a fundamental strategic security interest for the United States. The United States has nuclear weapons strategically located in NATO countries in Europe. In fact, it has just about 100 B-16 gravity nuclear bombs that are stationed strategically in NATO countries, in Belgium, in Germany, in Italy, Netherlands, also in Turkey. What does this mean? It means that these nuclear bombs can be launched in Europe should there need to be for that to happen. Now, we now turn our attention to another post-Cold War imperative, and that is the matter concerning US's withdrawal from the 1987 Intermediate Range Nuclear Forces Treaty. Now, in 2018, the President of the United States, Mr. Trump, decided to withdraw from this INF treaty, arguing, of course, that Russia was not complying. It entered into force 2019, and the importance of the INF treaty is that it's an arms control treaty with Russia, and the effect of the withdrawal meant that states could now deploy ground-range missiles within a range of about 5,500 kilometers. This Russia interpreted as creating a serious disruption to the security framework in Europe, and it was also considered as a threat to its own security. Now, what is the rationale behind the Russian invasion of Ukraine? It's important to note that strategically, Ukraine is important to Russia. It has a large agricultural industry, and it also has important ports on the Black Sea. Russian and Ukrainian have ethnically connected people dating back to the 19th century. Geographically, they are located in close proximity to each other. In fact, they share a border in the east. And Ukraine was a part of the Soviet Union. It gained independence only in 1991, following the demise of the Soviet Union. We also have to take our lenses to focusing on the Cold War security organizations. So you had two of them. You had NATO and the Warsaw Pact. Now, NATO was created in 1949 as a containment strategy to provide collective security against the Soviet Union. And it had membership from the United States, Canada, and of course, European powers. Now, the Warsaw Pact was created in 1955 as a counter to NATO during the height of the Cold War period. And it too was a collective defense treaty with membership from Eastern European countries, as well as the Soviet Union. So it's important to note that in 1991, this pact was terminated following the end of the Cold War. Now, as we speak about the end of the Cold War and the Soviet Union, the question that we have to ponder is, was the Soviet Union the loser within with the end of the Cold War? As we would say it in international relations, is it that the end of the Cold War, was it a zero-sum game for the Soviet Union? And we have to note here that the Soviet Union was a major loser following the unification of Germany and the end of the Cold War. Communism toppled, the Warsaw Pact ended, Soviet Union disintegrated, Eastern European states declared their independence. And of course, the pride and the prestige once enjoyed by the Soviet Union was not automatically transferred to Russia. In fact, the bipolar Cold War world, where you had two powers, the US and USSR, had now emerged into a unipolar world with the United States as the hegemon. So the United States, the Soviet Union's rival during the Cold War, seemed to be the winner following the end of the Cold War. And this, of course, was captured in President Putin's view concerning the end of the Cold War, where he laments the collapse of the Cold War. And I'll just read this quotation for you. He said, open quote, "It was a disintegration of historical Russia under the name of the Soviet Union. We turned into a completely different country, and what have been built up over 1,000 years was largely lost. 25 million Russian people in newly independent countries suddenly found themselves cut off from Russia." This part of what he believes was a major, and open and close quotation here, using it, a major humanitarian tragedy. He also laments the setback for Russian power. And in quotation, he says, "The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century." Just think about that. The collapse of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. Those were taken from a speech he made in Sochi, Russia, December 8, 2021. So in terms of the post-Cold War dynamics, we have to understand that NATO expanded and became more powerful. You had societal security dominated the newly independent Eastern European states. The focus for them was really on nationalism, preservation of their language and culture and their national identity. And of course, to couple with all of that, the Warsaw Pact ended, but NATO continued to exist. And in fact, it not only existed, but it increased its membership among Eastern European states. And on top of that, it still maintained Article 5, which is enshrined in NATO and stipulates that an attack on any member state is also an attack against all member states. So to put it in context, I have a map here to show NATO membership, how it expanded in the, there. I'm sorry, I've lost my presentation. I shall try to share it again. So as I was saying, it expanded its membership in the post-Cold War era. It now has 30 members, but it added 14 members in 1997 from Estonia, that is located here at number 1, all the way to Bulgaria. And note that Russia is located, if you look at the map, it's located here. To its west, you have Belarus, which is pro, I keep losing my slides, but you have Russia, and you also have Belarus, which is pro-Russian, and then you have Ukraine. So that gives us a sense of the geographic location of how Russia is located in relation to these countries. Okay, so as we proceed, we want to find out then, what is it that Russia wanted and Ukraine prior to February 24, 2022. Now, Ukraine wanted to exercise its rights as a sovereign state, to join NATO, to join EU, to increase the influence, Western influence in its state, and Russia wanted to obtain assurances that Ukraine would not join NATO, that it would not join EU, and that it would not increase Western influence, and that, of course, it would recognize the Donbas region as independent of Ukraine. Now, in terms of the actions and the rhetoric prior to the Russian-Ukrainian war, we saw hundreds of Russian troops deployed along the Ukrainian-Russian border. We heard the Russian president's rhetoric that he will not be fighting a war. We know very little about what was happening in Ukraine, whether Ukraine was preparing for war. And we heard from the Ukrainian president the rhetoric that it wants peace and it wants to negotiate. And of course, that appears to be what NATO and the rest of the world also wanted. Now, we speak now, turn our attention to the Russian-Ukrainian war strategies. We saw that Russia used standard war fighting strategies, standard textbook war fighting strategies, shock and awe, rapid dominance, attacking amphibious type warfares, air, land, and sea, and of course, using counter value and counter force strategies. Oh dear, okay, let me try to reshare. I don't know why it keeps stopping, so just bear with me. I'm almost at the end. All right, so, and in Ukraine, of course, we saw that there's a combined sort of improvised use of military warfare strategies here, where the military was used, but also civilians as war fighters, men 18 to 16 given arms, and women making and using bottle bombs. Now, when we talk about visualizing the post-war era for Russia and Ukraine, there are 4 options that I have documented here. So option 1, if Russia wins the war, what will happen, what is likely to happen is that if it's likely to be full annexation of Ukraine. Option 2, if Ukraine wins, it's likely to be full pursuit of NATO and EU membership aspirations. However, for option 3, if war escalates with NATO's involvement, then it's likely to have escalate to a World War III and with the use of nuclear weapons. Option 4, I contemplate as if Russia decides to pull troops and stop bombing, then there's even at this stage, there's the possibility for the continuation of negotiations and concession making. Now, we quickly turn our attention to the implications for the region. So we quickly turn to the implications for the region, and I've quickly documented just about 3 here, noting that Ukraine and Russia combined produce just about 30% of the world's grain. And this includes, of course, corn, barley, and wheat. And the war is likely to create shortages due to disruptions in production, supply, and distribution of grain. The consideration for the region, therefore, is that we're in a crisis, and crisis creates opportunities for promotion of healthy lifestyles and also the development of cross-agency solutions. Possible solutions is to develop local agriculture to ensure food security. For example, use breadfruit and cassava to produce flour, and also encourage the consumption of more plant-based proteins such as beans, peas, and lentils. And of course, that would require some level of government support. And just quickly to point out the fact that Russia is the world's 3rd largest oil producer and exporter. So that, of course, will have implications for Jamaica as an oil importing state, and also for some of the other oil importing states in the Caribbean region. So it's a crisis. The importance here is to, it provides an opportunity to convert to sustainable energy. I'm sorry, I keep losing my PowerPoint slides. So,
Haughton, might I suggest you stop sharing your screen, and you know, we know we're onto something. We're in an interesting forum when people find the need to do what's happening now. So,
right, okay.
But I suggest you no longer share. Thank you.
All right, so I'll stop sharing, but just to point to the fact that Russia is the world's 3rd largest oil producer and exporter, and as a oil importing region for the most part, reduction in the oil supply market has driven up oil price, and of course this will negatively impact on consumers and on businesses. And of course the crisis here will create the opportunity to convert to sustainable energy alternatives, such as the use of solar and wind technologies. And governmental support for these initiatives may also include things like subsidies and strategies for businesses and households to convert to renewable energy sources. And I believe that these technologies will also help in the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions. And the government could consider about embarking on a countrywide rollout in order to reduce dependency on oil. And finally, I turn my attention now to the sanctions. Sanctions imposed on Russian businesses and access to global financial systems may negatively affect the region where such entities exist. And the consideration for the region is that Caribbean states might opt to increase their shareholdings and continue operations. Concerning the conclusions, I conclude by saying Cold War has ended, but balance of power dynamics continue to shape relationships between states. The Russian-Ukrainian war has its roots in power politics. It cannot be solved it can only be resolved, through negotiations that understand these dynamics. and for Ukraine and Russia to peacefully coexist in the geographic spheres of Europe, the survival of each should not existentially threaten the security of the other. And peripheral states are better suited, not focusing on proxy alignments, but on their national interests, however they define them to be. And finally, proper mitigation mechanisms across the Caribbean region will determine how well we adapt to energy and food insecurity resulting, of course, from the Russian-Ukrainian war. I thank you very much for listening. And later, I now turn over the proceedings to Dr. Vassiani, our moderator.
Professor Haughton, even keeled in the midst of it all. Thank you so much for your presentation. You have made us think about issues of war, security. You have guided us through definitions and identifying from a matter of international law. You have shared with us issues of sovereign territory. You have given us comparative figures on military budgets, nuclear capabilities, post-Cold War imperatives, issues of geopolitics, issues of intergovernmental security organizations, NATO and the Warsaw Pact. What an interesting and informative presentation. Thank you so much, Professor Haughton. And I will now invite our next speaker, Dr. Christine Clarke. So for those of you who do not know, our faculty has a number of departments and centers, including the Department of Government, the Department of Psychology, Sociology, and Social Work. We have SALISES, we have the Center for Disability Studies, Management Studies, well known as Mona School of Business and Management, but we also have the Department of Economics. This is where Dr. Christine Clarke, our next presenter, lectures. She has a BA in Honors in Economics and Mathematics from Mount Holyoke College. She has a PhD in Public Finance from Rice University in Houston. With us at Mona, she lectures in economics. She is a chair of the graduate committee with responsibility for all postgraduate degrees in her department. Dr. Clarke is an established author on different aspects of the IMF and the implications for Jamaica and the region. Her research areas include public finance, economic development, the economics of sport, and the issue of resilience. She has published articles on wage determination in Jamaica and on a number of development issues in the Caribbean. She has several book chapters as well. Dr. Clarke serves as a director on the board of the Bank of Jamaica, where she uses her audit certification as the chair of the audit committee. And she's also an independent director on the only listed used car dealer JetCon Corporation. Dr. Clarke also has practical experience, and she has worked at the Planning Institute of Jamaica as the Director of Economic Planning. We look forward to your presentation on the economic aspects and the issues of political economy of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Thank you for joining us, Dr. Clarke.
Thanks, Dr. Vassiani and our Dean, Ambassador Ward, as well as Professor Haughton, who went ahead of me, colleagues from the department and our students that have so graciously joined us, and I'm sure are chomping at the bit to participate in question and answer. So I am very happy to have received this invitation and also to be put at this point in the lineup, because in my research preparing for this talk, I realized that there centuries of history that have kind of preceded and have influenced what we are seeing now, particularly for those who would not have had the breadth of a history or a European history, even American history set of courses, that there have been many things that have been unpacked by Ambassador Ward and Professor Haughton that I think are really important and will form the basis of future research that will try to link, especially in hindsight, what we would have seen over the course of 2022, as well as, link it to its historical, political, international relations and other dimensions of its antecedents. So my point of departure then is from the two presentations that you've had before. I do have a PowerPoint presentation, but given what was happening on the screen, I will go from my print. There are some potential issues clearly emanating from what we've heard as far as the international relations, the international organization dimensions of the presentations thus far. Of course, in Jamaica and perhaps the rest of the Caribbean region, we know that many of our countries, as SIDS, have been through several waves of or engagements with the fund, as well as different forms of support from other multilateral organizations, all of which we know can potentially be impacted by this, ongoing invasion that we're observing, depending on what, for example, the United States' eventual position in terms of part of the aggression or part of in its current stance, how it will respond and how that response may, for example, alter its policy interests. It may increase its policy interests and geopolitical interests in our region and therefore have implications for us, or it may divert interest from the issues relating to the Caribbean and Latin America, and therefore could impact the extent to which we have that engagement from those multilateral organizations. Some may, from their perspective, be happy for that, but that would have implications for many projects. The EU has been an important player in our Jamaica's own budget arrangements, supporting, providing extensive support as far as budget is concerned. And so clearly also their response, their stance, and their prioritization of the issues relating to this invasion and whatever it may become eventually is going to have some impact on our affairs, if you would put it that way. The relations among the key players, you've seen Professor Haughton has outlined clearly the NATO, Warsaw Pact, and all the attendant issues there. If there were to be any divergence of views between the key players in that arena, we can clearly see that that could even further maybe stall a resolution in relation to this issue, or provide other areas in which conflicts may emerge that again will contribute to the dissipation of interest in Caribbean issues, certainly in small states like ours. As that dissipation advances, the diversion of interest in our issues in helping us to navigate various forms of reform, various areas of reform, even the very food and energy security projects that were advanced by Prof. Haughton, then we would begin to see some implications for what we can do. Certainly, we are resilient, and we'll talk about some of the impacts there, but there would be some time in transitioning to homegrown or local or regionally generated solutions. And so that will have clear implications, the wait time for what life will be like from an economic, a socioeconomic, and we hope not, but also from the environmental perspective. And then, of course, we cannot see everything as if we're looking in a glass bowl right now. So there could be potential second and third round effects that we don't know about. We can't necessarily identify them at this point. And those will have clear implications once these different position points, these different nodes in what we might call, a kind of game theoretic framework, what those would have for the ultimate state of the environment as far as Caribbean economies and societies are concerned. Of course, it is not possible for me to make this presentation without alluding to one that we would have done under Dr. Vassiani's guidance a couple months ago, where we looked at the state of Caribbean economies just coming out of the COVID-19 crisis, or, trying to cope. And in many ways, we have not solved the problems that were raised there. And I had brought back some of my slides just to show that many of the uncertainties, the risks, the challenges with growth, even though they seem to be recovering, are now going to be under even more strain and stress as we go through this period. Human capital development, many schools would have just finally fully reopened for face-to-face. And so this, the ability, for example, of the school plants to keep running in the event that electricity prices were to continue to escalate in response to oil prices, there are certain kind of existential questions that we may have to revisit. And whilst the Caribbean economies, I had a slide just indicating that, yes, most economies in the region have registered some amount of growth for the 2021 calendar year. Jamaica coming in at somewhere around 4.6% after having declined by 10.1% in 2020, up to St. Lucia registering a return to growth of 3.5%, whereas they had contracted largely due to the hit to tourism of 20.4%. The point that we're making here is that a large portion of that was driven by the return of tourism and other forms of economic activity that would be now making major demands on the local grid, as well as on our fuel demands. And so we can clearly see how potentially tenuous this recovery is. And I think all our finance ministers and prime ministers, as they go through this period now of casting a budget for the 2022-23 fiscal year, will be having the issue of the Russia-Ukraine events clearly pinned down as best as possible. And you will see, and most of you would have seen already for Jamaica, we've seen the Barbados one, a more conservative approach to setting of the budget in the event that there are further deteriorations that governments have to try to respond to as best they can. So overall, what I see is that we're in a very tenuous transition period. We have our pre-2021 period, 2020 thereabouts, when we're trying to kind of navigate our way through the initial onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, where focus was on controlling the spread, trying to recover quickly because we thought we could have done so in a year. Little did we know that it would be prolonged for 2 years. We also in the region, I think, wanted to maintain whatever positive changes we were seeing now in the healthcare system during that first year in social protection, the rapid scale up of intervention, as well as governance. We saw far more communication than we may have ever seen in the previous years since independence. During 2021, we came front and center. We were confronted with the issues of care. We saw the hospitalization issues, the demand for oxygen, economic stagnation being somewhat setting across the region, the vaccine mandates that were part of the rhetoric that many countries in the region stayed away from. and the attempts to roll out this vaccine program that had many fits and starts, and some may say are what is maybe had prolonged the return to work and face-to-face operations. The waves, when would they end? And so that contributed to an extensive period of uncertainty, persons weighing the risks individually, collectively for their family and for their extended network that they operated in. And then, of course, the discussions about the universal components that were needed in social protection, as well as the interface between that and informality and how to reach persons who, because of our structural issues in the society, are just not part of our civil registration and or other databases. So what are we seeing now for 2022? Well, as we go into 2022 in terms of the fiscal year and beyond, I call it 2022 plus, of course, recovery is still a major part of the emphasis and will be for Caribbean economies. Yes, we saw the growth rates tick up, and that is certainly welcome. But of course, I don't think there is any Caribbean nation that has recovered to the point that they were prior to the onset of COVID and the major impacts. Well, apart from, I think maybe Guyana because of the 2019 numbers. What we are looking at the same time is, given the potential impacts of the Russia-Ukraine crisis on energy, on seed oils, many of us have perhaps substituted away from our traditional forms of cooking oil and are using safflower oils and sunflower oils in our cooking and other activities. We're seeing that the implications, whilst we may not be importing directly from Ukraine as a source market, clearly the changes that the contractions will have in Ukraine will impact the global market for these types of goods and services. And so we could see not just an impact on price and quantity, but also logistics issues. Because of course, as supply shifts left, all our econ students can tell you, we can see changes in both price and quantity. And these will compound the impacts that we would have been battling with, emanating from the logistic challenges from the COVID-19 constriction. So social protection is going to remain a major plank, if you will, of any economic policy in the region because of these kind of live wire issues that are going to be experienced or could mushroom into more significant challenges for the region. How we work through those issues, again, will hinge on how policy responds. Digitalization has been touted as one of the key planks that can help to try to improve the targeting mechanisms, try to identify and reach persons who need more the assistance very significantly. That is one plank. But then there are other components, of course, the financing of any new measure at this point, as we had seen in the post-budget discussions for the minister's presentation, are going to face the question of how are we going to fund anything additional at this point without compromising too many other important things that I will also want to speak to. And more importantly, I think for 2022 and beyond, what we are going to be dealing with is, instead of us quote unquote, being able to go back to normal in terms of how we were, let us say in September 2019, what we are finding is an expanded risk horizon. We are not going to be able to get rid of all the uncertainties. There are going to be more balls that we have to juggle and try to keep afloat. Some heavier than others, some with content that we would rather not be in something that we're juggling. And so the risk landscape, and therefore what each individual, each country and the region will have to deal with as we even talk about the political realities, geopolitical issues, taking positions, clearly working on what those positions are individually as countries in the region, as well as the regional take, are widening, as well as I think also deepening. So now we're seeing, and it's been going around recently, a potential COVID-19, it seems 3.0, where we see that, for example, in China, almost 30 million people have recently been put on no movement, on lockdowns. The escalation of the invasion, that is always something that we're watching to see what will the next moves be, and by whom, to what extent, and with what impact, at least locally, and therefore we can maybe extrapolate to the international implications. Of course, there is always the potential for some wider economic fallout. Yes, we see the sanctions that are being targeted right now at Russian and Russian citizens globally. But might it be that this could have a global economic impact? We see also warnings being issued to China to be careful about the ways in which they go about their foreign policy as far as it relates to Russia in the context of the sanctions, and what effect that might have, again, coming full circle to my first points about, bilateral interests locally. We see there are quite a few projects that have been implemented and that are currently underway through that relationship that Jamaica has with China. How might those be impacted, and what implications would a slowdown in those projects have on our projected growth rates, employment activity, and other economic spin-offs that we get from the construction industry, which has been a kind of cornerstone in terms of also the recovery effort. We see even early on in the crisis, the government did give particular exemptions to construction workers to facilitate the continuation of those activities locally. And then, as Prof. Haughton indicated, there are also issues of food security that we will have to contend with. What does that mean locally? Many of us, if not most of us, live in urban areas that would not necessarily facilitate, a kind of eat what you grow at the individual household level. So how would that work? And I'm sure we could do a session like this, a 2.0, with other stakeholders who could maybe shed some light on what that would look like in this context. The energy security issues, of course, remain center stage. And so as we go forward, the economic impact that I would want to maybe highlight at this point, of course, centers around uncertainty and risk. In the COVID-19 panel that we did last semester, uncertainty planning was something that I raised as, where policy has to be at this point. Therefore, we are not necessarily going to see governments making specific commitments that are on a large scale, but more conservative offerings that allow room for reprioritization, reallocation of expenditure items, where projects, for example, are lagging, where you see a need, a reprioritization there until the situation stabilizes. The tools to do some of these things, as you say, it's kind of, there are lots of interlocking circles here. And so our ability to target is going to always be the binding constraint here if we are indeed trying to reach the most vulnerable. So for tourism, that will become or continue or remain as a main component of this uncertainty, because of course, as tensions escalate and the potential for the economic fallout increases, then persons may be a little bit more hesitant to travel, maybe not as much from our main US destination, but of course that from the European continent and other countries in that area. Will debt defaults, another critical variable that is being watched, become a major focusing issue in the financial sector, and therefore impact, what happens, what will the Fed do, etc. that will become, some key nodes that we will need to watch from the region. As far as markets go, I already spoke about the issues of price, quantity, and not just those two, but also of logistics. Getting goods to market at this point is going to rise in importance, just as the price and quantity of the goods. And so fundamentally, that one kind of number that we look at, the growth prospects are going to be hinged on how most of what Professor Haughton and Ambassador Ward would have pointed to in their presentation. How will it all play out over time? So as I said, what we're seeing is conservative interventions where we can make certain long-term strategic and structural changes in our economy structure is where we're seeing it. At the individual, even the regional level, the coping strategies as we navigate this uncertain environment against the adverse social consequences that could be part of the fallout will be front and center, I'm sure, in the halls of policymaking. So in terms of recommendations, as I try to wrap up so that we can get into a good question and answer session, clearly what we'll have to have is a continuation of conservative but well-planned interventions. Policy has to be flexible, has to contend with the uncertain environment, because unfortunately, whilst last semester we might have thought, okay, we're maybe winding down and we're coming to the end of this period when we can go back to smooth waters. Unfortunately, as SIDS, we are learning now that, planning for shocks, developing even in the context of shocks will be with us for some time yet, as many of you would have also been aware of our impending or imminent experiences with climate change. And so we are going to have to be able to basically contend with the juggling while, putting the key men on the board, on the different spaces on the board, to ensure that we kind of have the critical things covered. Of course, in that context, we have to continue building the fiscal, monetary, and resilience buffers as far as we can, while responding, of course, to the current issues that are affecting our societies and our nations. Because obviously, we can't be saving for the long term while not outing any fires that we're experiencing now. There needs to be special focus on the expanded vulnerabilities. So, initially we thought that, okay, we had, COVID and we're looking at the typical groups. Now we're seeing, for example, that they're COVID orphans. And so how do we treat with them? How do we incorporate them in the whole landscape and schema? We're now talking about closing learning and behavioral gaps that teachers and principals are now identifying as critical kind of things that must be addressed at this point before we go into a new academic year. As I mentioned, there's also the issue of uncertainty planning. How can we make our policy cycles whilst being accountable, whilst being adhering to the principles of good governance and transparency and all of that? How do we make our policy cycles more flexible? How do we arm policymakers, or how do policymakers arm themselves or enable themselves to be armed with adequate databases, data sources that can provide real-time or automatic, as far as is possible, interventions where is able. And of course, in this, communication and expectation management is going to be key in terms of the ability of policymakers to hold the reins whilst not scaring the horse away, as it were. Over the long term, we will have to, and perhaps we are already doing so, rethinking the extent to which we are incentivizing or encouraging the switch over to renewable energy. We see perhaps some amount of competition between our Jamaican approach, what the Barbados government is prepared to offer on the matter of electric vehicles. We are yet to see if Jamaica will give any more consideration as the Prime Minister gets ready to speak and the Minister of Finance will close. We'll see. There's also a perennial discussion about waste to energy and what that could possibly do, how that could transform some of the environmental and other ills that we'll have. We can't lose sight of that in the context, as I said, of our of the imminent advent of climate change. Smart cities, smart grids, those would come there. Another aspect of the long-term structural reform, we 10 years ago, Jamaica's numbers of pension coverage was just under 10%. 10 years later, it's just under 12%. And so our ability to, again, deal with or address informality was making the expansion of this kind of pension coverage contributory and non-contributory as far as is possible. That coverage has to expand significantly if we are to ensure that when we are able to, we are part of a system that provides for us for the period when we're not. And then we're seeing the return to face-to-face, to working face-to-face also. And so the issues with respect to our public transportation network, not just the buses, not just the roads, but the whole articulation based on the nodes of activity are of critical importance. And of course, we understand that that would be over the long term. So thank you for listening. And thanks again to Professor Haughton and Ambassador Ward for giving me the nice context that I could just go into the economic dimensions of what's on the horizon for Caribbean economies. Thank you.
And what an evening we have had. Chock full of information and a little excitement as well. Thank you very much, Dr. Clarke. We have learned some issues about COVID 3.0, issues of sanctions, what are some of the bilateral interests, the uncertainty facing the tourism sector, and issues of fiscal and monetary issues, as well as supply chain issues. Thank you very much for your presentations. So we have had a wide range of issues presented to us this evening, from issues of international law, issues of the diplomatic efforts and negotiations of Caribbean states, whether we stand together. We have had from Ambassador Ward, we have had from Professor Haughton issues about war, security, geopolitics, the role of NATO, and now Dr. Clarke has shared with us the economic dimensions of the Russia-Ukraine crisis. We have a few minutes left, and this seminar has shown us what an appetite there is for issues in the public domain and for a more measured approach and discussion of these issues. And we're really grateful to everyone who has signed on today. We will take a few questions. Might I remind you that we encourage a respectful environment. You may type your questions in the chat, and this is how we will proceed. Depending on your questions, we will direct them to the appropriate presenters. Okay, so I am now checking the chat for your questions, because this is how we will proceed. I know that a number of persons have already raised their hands, but I would ask you if you could type your question in the chat. I know there are many questions. Okay, so Brittany Clarke says, very informative session. Good evening all from Akeem Waite. And we have a direct question here, if I could. So Akeem Wait asks, should the US and NATO have applied more stringent sanctions against Russia after the invasions of Georgia and Crimea? Perhaps that would have deterred Russia's current actions in Ukraine. Another question, we'll take these two and give each presenter who would like to respond a chance. We have from Samantha Mitchell, all speakers made mention of the economic situation that the Caribbean faces during this war. Taking into account the economic and political future of the Caribbean, Jamaica to be specific, should we have taken a specific stance? We also have from Andrew McDaniel for Ambassador Ward, regarding the water crisis in Crimea, Russia has to bear the economic burden for that. Diplomacy has failed. So at what point is military force used to solve the issue of national interest when diplomacy fails? Let us take those three first regarding the water crisis, whether, I'm trying to go back up, whether there should have been more stringent sanctions earlier. And let's see, Ambassador Ward, would you like to address any of those?
Well, we have to put it in context of what was Russia's intention at that time. And when you compare the intention in invading Georgia to their intention in invading Ukraine, it's really two different types of invasions. One is outright annexation intended of Ukraine territory and to subject Ukraine to the Russian sphere of influence and to divorce Ukraine from liberal democratic traditions and so on and so forth. But everything is in hindsight, in a sense, that when was that invasion? 2008, I think it was. President Bush was the president at the time. There was an election campaign going on in the US. There are all kinds of different factors. The EU in particular, because of its dependency on Russian oil, and certainly the entire global community on the supplies from Russia in terms of wheat and so on. The challenges were much less pronounced where Georgia is concerned. This time around, between Russia and Ukraine, I think it's about 30% or so of grain exports to the world. So the circumstances were somewhat different. And in hindsight, we could say, would it have made a difference in terms of Russia? We've seen in the past, what is it now, 14 years since then, Russia has been building up what we thought was its military forces, but its invasion of Ukraine has proved to us that its military force is really numbers and not modern. Lots of numbers, but really is not a modern military force. So it's really hard to tell what they would do under those circumstances.
Thank you, Ambassador Ward. Professor Haughton, would you like to respond to any questions?
All right, thanks, Dr. Vassiani. Concerning the issue of sanctions, I think that we have to understand sanctions within the wider context of national interest. And as Ambassador Ward has mentioned, that in hindsight, we can possibly say that maybe sanctions could have been imposed on really tough sanctions being imposed on Russia following the invasion of Georgia. But the real challenge with sanctions is that, as we know, they tend to hurt states that are considered as wrongdoing states, as well as states that are wronged almost in the same kind of way. As Ambassador Ward mentioned about states having their own particular interests and don't necessarily want to curtail their Russian oil importation. Those are some of the kinds of national interest concerns that militate against harsher or tougher sanctions. And we have seen that played out even in this context, the Russian-Ukrainian situation, where the states, European states, really had a lot of discussion surrounding who would impose what sanctions. Is it that the SWIFT system should use, and it takes a little while for them to sort out their national interest concerns to see the sort of impact that the imposition of sanctions would have on their own economies. So we have to also take those issues into account. And I think that those issues, of course, would have formed a part of the consideration concerning the Russian-Georgian situation.
Thank you, Professor Haughton, for your insights there. I know there are some questions on the economic aspects. I would like to give Dr. Clarke the opportunity. There is a question from Ms. Richards on when will Jamaica change or improve our fiscal policy? You know, I think our students give us great ideas for exam questions, but we cannot continue importing more than 90% of our consumption. There is another question or comment from Mr. Christopher Chinapu. Energy security and the energy transition have been a failure of the fallout from the crisis. How should the region respond in the short and long term to ensure energy security and transition that provides a cushion to the vulnerable in our society? I'm going through the other questions, but Dr. Clarke, please have a go at any of these.
Sure, thank you. In terms of changing or improving fiscal policy, I guess that is one of the things that is always iterative and has to be done. As we saw in this budget, the minister is trying to navigate the waters in terms of persons would have loved to see, for example, the gas tax being rolled back, but he is advancing an approach on the expenditure side to try to do more targeted support to the more vulnerable. Is there a right way? Is there a wrong way? Well, we know that there are challenges in targeting, as I indicated before, the inability to identify very well at any given point in time the most vulnerable. Yes, we have our general groups, as I alluded to, you know, children. We have programs for pregnant and lactating mothers, for at-risk youth, but in the context of the crisis, those most hit, it's not always going to be, you know, right in your face, who are the persons, and be able to target your help there. And so that's one of the challenges. I see the comments about 90% of what we consume. That is a, you know, kind of issue that has plagued Jamaica for a long while, or manufacturing capacity or ability to produce value-added goods. It's not something that's going to be fixed, and certainly it's going to be very difficult to fix it in a crisis, because that may require particular forms of interventions, for example, for first movers, or to set up parks or clusters that it's going to be difficult to do that in a crisis. Furthermore, if you're not sure where this output would go and at what price it would be sold, then you have the situation where the government could very well back production that is not bought or not exportable again because of its price point, as well as I said, also have to be able to overcome any logistics issues we would have to get our own exports out to market. And so where you don't have that already in the context of a global logistics challenge, then you may be finding significant difficulties to do that. And so, you know, we can say a crisis, we don't want to waste it, we want to go ahead and do that now, but there are risks in venturing down this road at this particular moment. As far as energy security is concerned, and as we indicated, I think the experts or the persons that have been most vocal in this arena have focused on the transitions to renewable. I think we have more renewables now as part of our production of electricity than we ever had before. Could it be more? Perhaps. What is the most effective way to do this? You mentioned doing this, but at the same time, you're speaking about those who are most vulnerable. In a way, depending on the modality that we employ as far as renewables is concerned, those two are not necessarily go hand in hand, because again, many of the options that are available now require a capital outlay. And so the ability of the more vulnerable to afford them, even the average person, is going to be where the rubber hits the road. Yes, it can be put into the grid today. There, for example, even in the Water Commission, I saw something, I'm not sure how legitimate it is, that they will be implementing cutbacks to reduce the cost of operating in the context of higher electricity costs, which you know it requires electricity to pump water. And so again, you can see the feed throughs again that are going to be happening. So it's not necessarily a one-to-one relationship that, you know, energy security or renewables will redound to the economic benefit of the most vulnerable. It depends on how that is actually implemented and what are the methodologies. I'm not an energy expert, so I wouldn't venture into that arena. What I would say is that we have made strides. It may be argued that we could do it faster, but it's not clear as an a priori that will necessarily mean that the vulnerable and the poor would be better off from an economic perspective.
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. So we are now on 8:04. I am so happy that this discussion, this seminar has spurred so many questions, and I will try my best to go through another round if our presenters will oblige us for one last round of questions so we can wrap up shortly. There is a question to Ambassador Ward from Mr. Korbatsky. Don't you think that the international system was shattered long before the invasion of US? Without sanctions in Yugoslavia in 1999, Iraq 2003, Afghanistan and Libya. There are other questions on what would the implications look like for a Caribbean country that chooses to be neutral in the conflict arising. There were also questions regarding the role of the United Nations and the need for the UN Security Council and the UN in general to be reformed, spoken like true international relations students. We see our former permanent secretary asking some really thought-provoking questions. Ms. Alexander, thank you for joining us on questions on energy policy and whether this presents an opportunity for us to transition to renewable energy and energy efficiency. Professor Haughton, you know, there are questions here on food security, climate change, and I think the Russians will win the conflict, says Herbie, Mr. Mackenzie, but they won't win Ukraine. do you think the division of Ukraine along the Dnieper River would be a viable solution? I think this will take us way over our time, so may I ask each presenter to respond to the questions they wish to. I suggest each person take about a minute. My apologies to those of you who have not heard your specific question. There are some other questions on foreign direct investment and implications for China and so on. But I'm really happy we are engaged in this discussion and asking so many questions. So back to Ambassador Ward.
Well, quickly to address the invasion of Afghanistan, that was approved by the UN Security Council. Neither Russia or China vetoed the resolution which recognized that the 9/11 attacks on the US triggered Article 51 of the UN Charter for self-defense. So the Afghanistan invasion would not have triggered sanctions. In terms of Aleppo, unless, of course, the questioner meant the 1979 or 80 or thereabouts invasion of Afghanistan by the Soviet Union. I was referring to the US invasion in October 2001. So I'm not sure I'm answering the question asked or otherwise. In terms of Aleppo, yes, I believe there should be sanctions placed on the Russian military for what they did in Aleppo. They leveled the place, literally. But again, these would have had to be unilateral sanctions. And it was a different situation then because of the war on terrorism going on in Syria, where US forces, Russian forces, Iranian-backed forces, the Kurds, and you name it, were all mixed up in that war. And where the Russians were fighting terrorists, there was no opposition to them. But yes, what happened in Aleppo was reprehensible. And there should have been some accountability for that. There was some other reference. There are so many questions, Dr. Vassiani, that I don't remember half of them.
Well, Ambassador Ward, we will certainly have to invite you again, if even to speak to a smaller gathering. There were questions about the role of the UN, and that's another 2 hours. The role of the UN and proposals for reform of the Security Council.
I did respond to one of the individuals on chat who was asking about reform of the Security Council. They must have missed part of my presentation because I did speak on that issue.
You certainly did, Ambassador. I see already persons asking for part 2. We'll see about that. Thank you, Ambassador Ward. Professor Haughton.
Oh, thanks again, Dr. Vassiani. As mentioned, there are lots of questions and it's actually 10 minutes after 8. Yeah. But what I will do is I will just respond to one of the questions posed about whether I believe that the country should be divided. Now, that's a really tricky question. Divided Ukraine, which would possibly look half pro-Western and half pro-Russian. But what I would say is that I think that negotiations is what needs to work. And I quite like the fact that we have sort of external members who are trying to play a significant role in this process. I speak specifically of the Prime Minister of Israel, Prime Minister Bennett, who have in fact visited Russia and have had dialogues as well with Ukraine in trying to help to find a solution to this.
Professor Haughton?
Yes.
Okay, I'm just hearing you. No, I lost you for a little.
Okay. I have no idea where you've lost me, but I was just saying that I think that even at this late stage, there's still a place, a role for negotiations, and negotiations are ongoing, even though the fighting continues in Ukraine as well. So those are my comments concerning whether or not the country should be divided.
Thank you so much, Professor Haughton. And Dr. Clarke, might I ask you if you would like to respond? Let's wrap up by 8:15, so another minute for you, Dr.
Sure.
Clarke, and then we end our proceedings.
I see the questions about returning to Venezuela, I think was one of them, as far as I'm assuming the person was referring to the Petrocaribe arrangement. Again, everything is going to depend on, as was said before, how countries see their particular interests at any given time, how they see maybe evolving or eroding, depending again on how all the key actors, how they interact, how they respond, and any retaliation to the responses. So will Venezuela be open to that, given their own situation and scenario? That is one thing. I know the Ministry of Finance took up, I think they called it a strategic kind of debt management approach, and it may have been some kind of benchmark agreement to consolidate and to retire certain debt instruments. So it's not I don't think a kind of straightforward thing to go back there in the context of the markets, again, that we're operating in. As far as giving subsidies, whilst it sounds good to subsidize the food prices of domestically produced items, the question is, are you giving this subsidy to everybody? Are you trying to help the poor? If it is that you're trying to help the poor, the question is, are those the things that the poor eat and consume in terms of their preferences? And how will you distinguish between, as my public finance students know, the persons who are objectively, quote unquote, by some metric poor, and those who will make themselves appear poor in order to benefit from the subsidy, if it is you're doing a targeted approach. So the problems from the social protection angle, they don't go away if the government decides to give subsidies. It's the same problem. We went down that road in the 70s, I think, and early 80s, and we backtracked because of the challenges. Again, that would require some reduced expenditure elsewhere, because we don't expect, I don't think, this for this fiscal year to be making increased tax revenues. So what will we cut in order to do this? And it somewhat doesn't make sense to talk about reduce the corruption, because if there has indeed been corruption anywhere, that money would have already been spent. So we're talking about, we need new money to be able to do any new initiatives at this point. So the challenges, again, rear themselves regardless of the approach that fiscal policy is going to take. If you want to target, how will you identify accurately, and from where will the funds come in order to finance that intervention?
Thank you, Dr. Clarke. Ambassador Ward, as our keynote speaker, I would like to give you the opportunity to wrap up for us, if you would like to say any last words before I thank everyone and we go our separate ways.
Thank you, Dr. Bastiani. I don't know if I merit that distinction as getting the last piece in, because my two panelist colleagues have done an outstanding job explaining certain issues that are involved here. But I think I was just trying to respond to one of the questions about why didn't the UN do more to prevent the Ukraine crisis? And I was writing a response to the individual who asked a question, that when you consider that the UN Security Council is the body within the UN system under the UN Charter that has the authority to act, to prevent conflict, to stop conflict, and so on and so forth. With Russia being a permanent member of the Council, the Council cannot act against Russia. But I think this discussion is important because it's not only important because the issues are really burning issues on the minds of many people, but when you look at the misunderstandings of what's really going on, the geopolitics, the security strategies being pursued, and so on and so forth, the competition among the global powers. And we're coming out of, in the post-Cold War period, where we had a unipolar world with the US, the only superpower, with now Russia re-emerging as a superpower, or they want to be, and China certainly through its economic power and its military power as well. So I think these kinds of discussions are very important because there are lots of misunderstandings, and perhaps, hopefully, we are able to clear up some of those in our presentations. So I thank you very much for the opportunity and for being able to say the few words that I have.
Thank you, Ambassador Ward, and thank you everyone for staying with us to the end and for giving us your time. There is nothing else left for me to do but to thank our presenters, Dr. Clarke, Professor Haughton, Ambassador Ward, for really engaging discussion this evening. We have learned about international law, about war studies, about economic issues, about a little about cybersecurity too. I have to also thank our technical team and our marketing officer, Mrs. Francesca Lloyd McDavid, our IT team, Mrs. Keisha Sherman Howell, Mr. Joshua Bell, all with their calm professional support. I'd like to thank the faculty office for assisting us. And thank you to all our students, all our well-wishers, all our faculty members, all our guests, the entire social sciences community. And thanks also to Carib Nation TV for streaming our event, to members of the media who gave us the opportunity to promote our event, specifically Mr. Dervan Malcolm, Dr. Andrea Sutherland, Mr. Ralston Hyman. Thank you, everyone, and we look forward to having you again at yet another FSS seminar.